So I managed to get my hand on a ROG Ally, and I was pretty excited to pick it up, especially because I do like the Steam Deck quite a bit, and I'm excited to see this handheld PC gaming market continue to gain popularity and have more and more companies come in with some of their ideas. And the ROG Ally certainly has some ideas to it. And I know this has been gone over by a bunch of people because Asus sent these out a while ago for previews, so we have frame rate comparisons, battery life, all these different things. But today I wanted to spend some time going over things that Asus really didn't mention much, specifically inside of the device. So if you guys enjoy the video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe if you're new here to the Spawn Wave channel. Let's start first with an unboxing. I figured I picked it up new. We might as well go ahead and have that entire experience in the video. The box itself, I mean, it looks fine. It just has an etching of the ROG Ally itself on the front. On the back, there's just information around this specific ROG Ally that I have, which is the Z1 Extreme model. Opening up the box, we are greeted immediately with the ROG Ally. It has a plastic wrap around it, which is good for protection, but it also showcases how to plug it in. And, you know, I will say that based on the I/O on the top, it could trip some people up, so at least it's straightforward there. And then, of course, how to power it on. But moving that to the side, we do have a couple of boxes underneath, which does include our charger. It is just an overall charge brick, so you're not able to unplug the USB-C cable and then plug another one in or something to the brick. There's also another box inside that has a lot of the warranty and instructional information. Oh, and this is interesting. On one side, there's a little stand that's encased, and it's kind of just made out of like paper or styrofoam materials. It's not like exactly sturdy necessarily, but it does work, and basically it has the ROG, you can see the ROG logo there, but on the other side of it, there's a bit of a concave, and the Ally will sit in there, and I guess that way you can sit it up on your desk or something, and technically it works with the charge cord plugged in, considering it charges at the top. So, yeah, I guess you can kind of leave it in there if you don't want to hold it up or something, or if you just want to leave it there and kind of let it charge. It's a way to sort of display it, and I assumed it didn't cost them a lot of money to include it just based on the materials that it's made out of. Okay, so onto the ROG Ally itself, removing the plastic wrap around it. I will say this with Asus, they did at least show up to this sector with something that is a bit more aesthetically pleasing than the competition. The Steam Deck, while it is a good handheld, it looks functional, is the right word to say. Whereas Asus showed up trying to make something that looks good. It is all white, obviously, as you can see. It has the RGB lighting around both thumbsticks. And then on the back, we do have some of the vent holes kind of dressed up a bit, one as the ROG logo itself, and then you have like this color shifting strip that goes diagonal top left to the bottom right. Going back to the front of the system though, we are greeted by the 7-inch 1920 by 1080 screen in that 16 by 9 orientation. It is an IPS screen, and it has Gorilla Glass on the front as it is a 10-point multi-touch display. It has a refresh rate of 120 hertz, response time is 7 milliseconds, and the brightness comes in at 500 nits. For controls, we have 2 analog sticks in the asymmetric orientation, a D-pad that, well, it's there. We'll discuss that a little more later on. A, B, X, and Y in the top right. We have a couple of buttons around the screen, though. Start and select, but then we have 2 buttons that act more as hotkeys that we'll discuss a little later as well. And then we have 2 different speaker grills on the bottom right and left. On the top, we do have a 3.5 millimeter headphone jack, an SD card that does support UHS 2. We have Asus's like mobile connection alongside of the USB Type-C input that does work to charge, as well as data transfer as USB 3.2 Gen 2. We have a volume rocker next to that, a couple of indicator lights for charging and power on, as well as our power button. Behind those, you can see 2 large vents. We do have a dual fan setup here inside for cooling. And we also have our right bumper, right trigger, left trigger. I do like the texture on those as it does make it a bit easier to grip them. Left bumper and right bumper are pretty straightforward. They're just tactile buttons inside. However, right trigger and left trigger are a bit more interesting because they are using Hall effect sensors, that is magnets inside, and they are tracked by different sensors on the board. It's kind of neat because it does give a pretty reliable tracking method for either one of those. So whether you're playing a racing game or maybe a first-person shooter, it'll track the entire throw, whether it's really short or the whole way. And then we do have 2 buttons on the back that you can customize and set to whatever you would like for the game you're playing at that time. I also noticed that around the edges where you would be holding the Ally, it does have sort of this texture that's imprinted into it that makes for a better overall experience holding it. Gives you a bit of better grip, right? And this is something we've been seeing more and more with different controllers or handhelds, and I hope it's just more of a trend going forward, especially for these premium devices. I will talk very briefly about my experience using the Ally this past week. So initially I fire it up, I go into Game Pass, I start downloading different games. I had a problem though in that it wouldn't launch anything, and I realized that out of the box the date and time was off. So if this happens to you and you can't figure out why Game Pass isn't launching any games, it's because the DRM is kind of confused, and you just have to go down to the bottom right where you have the date and time and just adjust by going in there, unchecking the set to internet time, check it again, and it should be good to go. Anyway, after I got all that figured out, I downloaded some of the usual titles: Forza Horizon 5, Plague Tale, Yakuza Like a Dragon, because that's an awesome game I feel like to play in this form factor. And you have different power profiles you can pick. So I mentioned you have those 2 buttons around the screen that act as hotkeys essentially, and one will launch the Asus Armory and the other will launch the extended information that you can change things up on the fly, like your brightness, or if you want to use FSR, or if you want to change your power profile. So, for example, you can go into quiet mode, and that's like 5 or 10 watts or something, and then you can start moving up to turbo, and there's like an all-out mode, so you have like 15 watts, then you have 30 watts. If you go up to 30 watts, you have to understand your battery life is going to be terrible, and it was to the point where I could watch the percentage just go to tick down as I'm playing Forza Horizon 5. It's like you're driving these really fast cars, you assume the fuel gauge, you can just watch it tick down. Kind of the same thing here with the battery life on that right side. So because of this, I feel like most people would opt to turn down settings for textures, even resolution, to use that 15 watt mode in order to get a better, longer lasting battery out of the system. The only problem is at that point, that setting, it doesn't compete the best with the Steamdeck, and we've seen that in many of these benchmarks. And that kind of comes back to my biggest issue, or at least the Ally's biggest issue right now. It's not even really the battery life or maybe the temperature inside of it. It's actually Windows, as weird as that sounds, because the Steamdeck is set up out of the box with an experience that is molded and crafted to the Steamdeck, whereas the Ally is attempting to use Windows. So at this time, it's up to Asus to continue to refine and try to optimize Windows for this Ally device. But also, they have to kind of rely on Microsoft to understand that this market is kind of exploding, I would say, right now. Or at least it's in its infancy, and it has a shot at becoming very, very popular. So Windows needs to also be able to adapt to that. And that's something I would like to see Microsoft do. And the fact that they seemed very involved with the ROG Ally during the initial introduction event that they did a couple months ago, at least makes me think that they have plans to extend Windows to be more friendly with some of these handheld devices. Now, if we just talk about performance, it's pretty impressive to see things like Forza Horizon 5 running at 60 frames per second on a handheld. And while, again, it's not necessarily going to last more than an hour or two at best using this the 30 watt mode, I still had some pretty good frame rates at the 15 watt mode, and that was at 1080p, which, I mean, that's a big advantage here for the Ally. While it does have a 120 hertz refresh rate, very rarely was I able to get anything really moving above 70 or 80 frames per second of these titles, and that's dropping everything to low, going to 720p and upscaling. It's not something that's going to be utilized much unless you're playing older titles or maybe certain esports games. But finally, let's actually get into the ROG Ally. When I mean into the ROG Ally, I mean tear it down and take a look at what's going on inside. I also wanted to discuss some of the upgrade options and the repairability to it, because as we know, things go wrong. Your thumbstick could get messed up. The NVMe drive inside could get corrupted. The fans can break. So I wanted to also go over the the difficulty of fixing and repairing this thing. Let's start with the back, though. There are 6 Phillip head screws. The one in the middle at the bottom does not come out, okay? So if you have to open this up, just understand it's designed to sort of stay there. You just have to unscrew it to the point where it's loose, and that should be fine. The other 5, though, do come out. They're longer screws, and you're going to notice something as we go through. All the other screws, for the most part, are the same size, so it does make it a bit easier to keep track of everything here. Now, if you flip over, I do want to point out L2 and R2. As we had mentioned before, they're using Hall effect sensors, and you can kind of see the magnets in there. But what I really like about this, it feels like they saw R2 and L2 and realized that is going to take a lot of abuse, and there's a lot of throw to those buttons. They spent some time engineering this to be higher quality and a bit more reliable. They kind of remind me of laptop hinges to a degree, and they have 2 springs, and the design is high quality, so hats off to Asus for that. Unfortunately, I can't say the same thing about the little back buttons here. They're all plastic. Yes, they're just designed to press one tactile switch on the back of the board, but it's not exactly high quality stuff. It's pretty cheap. Anyway, shifting our attention back to the main unit, we can see everything here for the most part. We do have a do not disassemble sticker down here, which I figure is just for the battery. And yeah, we're not going to take the battery apart. That's probably not a great idea. But otherwise, looking around this, I mean, we can see our heatsink once you remove the sticker on top of it. You can see the fans. You can see the NVMe drive. In fact, everything is pretty easy to get to. First, though, you do want to unplug the battery, which, once again, is a little plug right here. So be able to unplug the battery that easily and then get to some of these things like the fans or the heatsink. It's definitely good for mods, and I'm sure many people will attempt a couple of things here. I do also like the dual fan setup that Asus decided to go with. Rather than try to have a larger heat pipe that maybe wraps around a single fan, they decided to try to split up the heat removal process between these 2 fans and eject all that heat out of the top, as you would expect. But the fact that we have 2 fans here, and yes, a single heat pipe, but going kind of in this split fashion, means that the fans themselves won't need to work as hard to expel the air and keep the APU at a decent enough temperature, which is probably why you're seeing fan speeds, or at least fan noise, how audible it is, be a bit quieter than what we see with the Steamdeck. I did remove the heatsink, right, because we're going to take a look at the chip, but the thermal compound is drier than I expected. I don't know if this is going to have a massive effect on temperatures, maybe a degree or 2. I'm going to replace this with MX4, but that was a bit surprising. The thumbsticks are on their own separate board, and in fact, the rumble motor is there, which is a good spot for it, considering it's right up against the palm of your hands as you are using the Ally. So you will get the maximum effect from it then. But when I removed the board, I realized that the analog stick, it's plugged in, but also screwed down on that side, which means replacing the analog sticks are pretty easy. So if these do drift on you, which from what I can tell, they're just regular analog sticks, so they probably will, it's not too bad. And really, you just have to have 4 screws come out to remove that board after unplugging the RGB ring, and then just a couple of screws to unplug the analog stick and replace it with a new one. Oh, and the split battery design is a good idea. It works to balance the device when you're holding it in your hands, as you want to have at least some weight to it, but trying to figure out where to put the battery in these systems is a whole other thing when it comes to the engineering. But I think doing it this way, where you have the battery essentially split into 2 and then resting in the palm area, it is good. The Wi-Fi antenna does run down to the bottom of the system, which typically you can kind of mess with reception by covering up with your hands, but that's a good spot as you're not really covering that at all. Removing the board and taking a look at it, it is a bit larger than the Steamdeck. I do like the red look. It kind of reminds me of my old Fatality motherboard. That's a trip down memory lane. After cleaning off the dried compound, we are treated to the Ryzen Z1 Extreme processor. This is Zen 4 architecture from AMD on a 4nm process. 8 core, 16 threads, 24 megabytes of total cache, up to a 5.1 gigahertz boost. Yeah, it's not messing around. You can kind of see why it just destroys the battery in this system. But on the GPU side, Radeon Graphics AMD RDNA 3, 12 CUs up to 2.7 gigahertz. And as they mentioned, 8.6 teraflops. The biggest weak point to what we're dealing with now for these APUs is certainly memory and just overall speed and bandwidth. As that continues to improve, then we'll probably see some of these devices be able to tackle that 120 hertz display at 1080p. I do like they stuck with the theme and also used red glue around the chip. It's a little touch that no one's really gonna notice, but I don't know, it's a fun little detail there. I do want to point out a few issues here, a few problem spots. All right, so while the power button is modular, which is great, that means like if you mash in the power button or maybe you drop it and it lands on it, you can replace that. You have to remove the board and do a lot to get there, but it is doable. The headphone jack and the SD card slot are not, and I am already envisioning SD cards going in backwards or some weird thing happening to where it destroys that, and that's really the only method of expanding the storage outside of breaking this down and inserting a new NVMe drive, so like a 1 terabyte or something. So unfortunately, if your SD card slot gets messed up, you're going to have to desolder and solder a new one down to the main board, and that is not a fun process. It would have just been way better to have the SD card on its own board, something you can unplug and then plug in. And we see that on devices all the time, so I guess this is just what Asus had to do to make it fit in this form factor. Headphone jack is the same thing. And that's unfortunate because if you mess up your headphone jack, it can cause all kinds of audio issues with the system to where it thinks something's always plugged in. And that's just another issue that probably could have been resolved with a separate board. Oh, when I said I would talk about the D-pad, it's just not very good. And looking at it from the inside is... I mean, the pivot point is small. It doesn't make contact with the board. And what you end up getting are a bunch of false presses because you can just mash the whole thing down and it just hits 3 or even 4, all of them at once. So yeah, definitely a big weak point here that Asus will have to go back to the drawing board. The D-pad needs some work. But for the most part, looking at the Ally, I have to give Asus some credit here. It's not difficult to get into the system. And when you do get the back off, you can pretty much get to whatever you need to with minimal screws having to come out. So if you have to replace the thermal compound, replace a fan, maybe upgrade or change out just the NVMe drive because there are issues, it's all right there with a couple of screws after the back comes off. So when it comes to repairability, outside of some issues like the SD card, the headphone jack, I'd say Asus did a pretty good job here for the most part. But that's going to do it here for our look inside the ROG Ally and some of my early thoughts and impressions on the device. I think it is a pretty neat system for the most part, and I feel like right now I'm more excited for the future of this sector than anything we have right this second. And a lot of that has to do with overcoming battery life concerns and even trying to figure out how to really open up these APUs, barring obviously the memory speed and bandwidth issues that they're currently facing. But for what it can do, it's still impressive to see how far we've come with these handheld devices and be able to play a lot of these console level experiences on the go. Again, 1080p 60 frames for larger titles like Forza Horizon 5, it is impressive. But let me know what you guys think about all this down below with the ROG Ally. Let me know if you picked one up and what your thoughts on it so far. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.